dissertation titles can be super confusing. So to kind of unpack that a little bit, the ancillary outcomes of co-management are the things that we don't expect to come out of co-management governance. So so stress, like I'll be talking about today, is one of these themes that comes out, but we don't always look for those things. So I kind of look where other researchers don't always focus in on. So with that being said, I will share my screen.
Oh, I think
do you mind making me co-host?
Yeah, should work now.
Does everyone see that?
Yep.
Sorry, 1 second. How do you play this thing? Oh. Maybe I'll help me out here. Where's the play button on PowerPoint?
Slideshow. I usually go to slideshow at the top there. Yeah. Top, like middle, beside animations, and yeah, and then presenter view or play from start. Yeah.
Oh, there's no way I can. Sorry, guys. I just don't. I need my notes. I don't have a double screen right now. I didn't think about this part. Okay, you know what? Sorry, give me 2 seconds. I'll just email my notes to myself and I can read them on my phone.
Sure, sure. Do you need to leave and then come back, or we could wait for a few minutes while you do that?
So it should be just 2 seconds. But like, feel free to talk amongst yourselves.
Sure.
How's the class, everyone? You're having fun? So far,
Yeah.
so good. Yeah, I heard that there's a bunch of different backgrounds in here. That's super cool.
Yeah, maybe let's do a very quick round of introductions. So maybe one by one, you can. Okay, let's start with Caitlin. Just very quickly, your name and your program, your research.
Yeah, hi, my name's Caitlin. I'm studying architecture, a master's of architecture. And right now my thesis is related to learning about different initiatives restoring Monoman wild rice in the Great Lakes region, kind of then the different spaces and relationships that are created through that amongst different people in the land. Yeah.
Great. Hannah?
Hi, Celeste. My name's Hannah. I'm doing my master's in biology at Waterloo, and I'm working in the field of paleolimnology. So I don't know how well people know it, but it's using sediment cores from lakes to reconstruct past hydrological and limnological variations. And so I'm working on a project that will be in the whooping crane breeding area in Northwest Territories. And so basically we're looking at kind of what conditions support the nesting of the whooping crane, but then also how these conditions have changed and kind of projecting with climate change, how they're going to be affected. So yeah, that's kind of why I was drawn to this course.
Thanks, Hannah.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Viv?
Hi, Celeste. Nice to meet you. So I'm doing my master's in environmental science at Laurier, and I did my undergrad in biology. I'm interested in this course because I'll be working on indigenous land. I just want to know, I just want to learn more in depth about their culture and their people.
Thanks, Viv. Kate?
Hi, I'm Kate. I'm in the Masters of Climate Change program, so it's more course-based, so I don't really have like a specific research area, but I did my undergrad in Indigenous and Canadian Indigenous history, so I very much have an interest in how to incorporate Indigenous knowledges into environmental policy.
All right, Mac?
Hi. Yes, my Mac. Yeah, so I'm doing my master's in human geography, and for my master's in research, I am working with the Decho and First Nations, essentially how we can use traditional indigenous knowledges into the into the implementation of in climate change policy and adaptation.
Awesome, a fellow geographer. Nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you.
Okay, Razvan.
Hey, good morning. So I'm Razvan, and I'm in the Master of Environmental Studies, and I think I'll be focusing on place names and food security and how that kind of has an impact on the Tlicha region in the NWT.
And Razvan is based there as well, right?
I'm in Yale Life right now. So.
In NWT, yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah. So Ryan.
Hi, Celeste. I was just telling the class that I will be starting the PhD geography program at Laurier, working with Dr. Siwi as well. So I'm really honored and excited to be able to do that. I'm particularly interested in how Indigenous knowledge contributes to environmental management programs and how to support and enhance self-determination efforts within nations. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, little does everyone know I use this course as a recruitment mechanism for my PhD program.
It worked. It worked.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Tanya.
Hi, Celeste. It's nice to meet you. I'm like Kate. I'm in the Masters of Climate Change program at Waterloo. So it's a course-based program. So I don't have a specific focus, but my background's in environmental education, and I was interested in learning more about Indigenous perspectives on climate change and how I can bring that into my work with the kids that I work with.
Perfect. And finally, I think Travis.
Morning, Celeste. Thanks for joining us. So my name's Travis, and as Miguel alluded to, I'm also currently in Ottawa. I grew up here, and I did a previous degree at Carleton University in sustainable energy. That kind of threw me into working with Natural Resources Canada. So I've worked in forestry, the division there, and then I've worked on some programming around the Southern Mountain Caribou in British Columbia. And then I've also worked on their clean energy innovation sector. So I've had some interesting experiences there throughout the federal public service. So I'm curious to hear about maybe some of your thoughts working at DFO. And then now I'm currently at the University of Waterloo, enrolled in the Masters of Economic Development and Innovation program. And I'm really trying to bridge climate action at a local level and how we meet our net zero by 2050 targets, while still creating, meaningful employment for folks in all types of different communities. And I've done some very not formal research, but just for research projects and papers on Indigenous community planning and clean energy planning, more in terms of energy sovereignty. And so that's been interesting just to look at last semester. But anyways, nice to meet you, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Nice to meet you too.
Okay. All right, I think that's everyone. Unless I missed someone, you can speak now. But how are we doing, Celeste?
We're good.
Okay.
Yeah,
Then all right, take it away.
Okay, well, first and foremost, thank you guys so much for having me here today. And I, like Miguel alluded to, or sorry, Professor Siwi alluded to, I'm joining you from Ottawa, Canada, which sits on the unceded land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of the land. We acknowledge their longstanding relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge holder keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. This meeting is being recorded, so if anyone is uncomfortable with their image or their video showing, please turn your cameras off. And so to start off this lecture, I'll just give you a brief overview about me and my experiences. So these pictures here are from my journey to Vancouver Island. I, partially chose the site because it's stunning. Like, look at that, right? So on the left here, we have Mark Labrie and Tawny Lem. Those are our collaborators with the Shirk Engage Partnership Grant that funded me to do this research. They facilitate the roundtable meetings and the co-management of fisheries on the west coast of Vancouver Island in several sites. And then on the right, we have my supervisor in my master's, my co-supervisor now, Nathan Young, who's the first author of the paper that I'll be presenting to you today. And that was us when we were doing some research on fish farms. There we go. So if you guys have read this paper, just paying homage to the authors that allowed me to share this information with you today. So let's get into it. Why study salmon fishing on the west coast of Vancouver Island? So first, I'll give you guys a bit of history. The process of co-management became popularized in the 90s. Co-management boards were created in efforts towards Indigenous reconciliation, and because DFO could not effectively manage resources that they weren't physically monitoring. Go figure, right? They needed help from the local guys to understand the state of the resource, and they needed multiple perspectives. So prior to the 1990s, the department was notoriously a closed-off bureaucracy, and it almost exclusively relied on internal science and decision-making. But events such as the 1992 collapse of the cod population off the coast of Newfoundland and the public anger that it received prompted a change in approach. So on the West Coast, we're seeing this change in approach in action. There's a lot of talk about the decline of salmon fisheries and it being similar to the cod collapse in '92. So because the salmon are declining in such great numbers, it's really impacting the coastal communities and the marine ecosystem, as you can imagine. So the change of governance that the DFO instilled was to now engage local knowledges, Indigenous knowledges, and just community voices, user groups, stakeholders, and that kind of thing. And this knowledge was to complement their natural science. So there are DFO scientists that still work in fisheries, obviously on the West Coast, but now we have other scientists who are employed by community groups, by Indigenous groups as well. So they kind of produce this web to validate that kind of knowledge. And then, like I said, it's complemented by the voices of the communities. So this is a quote that I found very powerful when I was doing my interviews on the West Coast with the stakeholders and Indigenous groups in the regions. So this was an Indigenous person who said this, and it kind of just shows the difference, the change in the resource and how it's impacting people. Like, that's a powerful statement. We used to be able to walk on the backs of salmon. He was alluding to some of the streams in Vancouver that are a little bit more shallow, and they were used to be so full of salmon that that you could walk on their backs, so to speak. So what is co-management? Co-management in the literature is defined as governance arrangements involving structured ongoing collaborations between central governments and representatives of groups or communities that have a historical or a geographic connection to the natural resource or territory in question. These systems are intended to connect state and local institutions, capacities, and knowledges in an effort to enhance the efficiency, accuracy, and legitimacy of environmental governance and decision-making. So very much this collaborative approach towards management. Let's go back there for a second. So I should note, in my work with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, basically what I do is I read all of the modern land claims agreements across the country. It took me forever. And we organized them so that we can understand what the trajectory of co-management is. How are we defining co-management through treaty? And what we found is that, or what sparked this research, is that co-management isn't actually defined in law. The best that we have is the wild salmon policy, which was signed in the Yukon, I believe, and it states co-management and it alludes to what this process is, but it doesn't actually define it. It's just a little bit of background for you guys there. So why co-management? We've all heard the saying, a jack of all trades is a master of none. But that saying is incomplete. The full saying is a jack of all trades is a master of none, but oftentimes better than a master of one. So what does co-management enable us to do? It brings all of these masters of one together. We get groups of stakeholders, each of them bringing their unique perspectives and different experiences to the table, and it creates a space to mobilize all of these kinds of different knowledges for the well-rounded management of the resource in question. So we're talking about fisheries today. That's the resource in question, or salmon specifically. So we know this, right? Like, when we're producing a project or an answer to a wicked question, you can't just have one kind of discipline working on it. You can't just have sociologists answering that question or bringing it back. We can't just have the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and have their internal scientists managing this resource that's based only on their one perspective and the barriers that they hold internally to their institution, the stock's going to collapse like it did in Newfoundland. So like I mentioned briefly, co-management is a tool towards the first bubble of reconciliation. So through treaties, Indigenous groups and the federal government commit to exactly how and where the department will share governing powers. So complementing this, co-management offers other user groups and stakeholders to share their expertise, giving them a voice to express how they think the resource should be managed based on their experiences. There are also natural scientists on the table that look at trends and expectations of the salmon to influence harvest and conservation strategies. So they look at the openings and closures of fisheries, marine protected areas, engagement strategies, things like that. I'm clearly not a natural scientist. So in all of this, you have open communication, which creates connection between all of these groups, getting to the third bubble there. The roundtables that I worked with are consensus-based. So what this means is that if all groups don't agree on the recommendation, and I'm talking about groups that have very different interests, like fish farmers, Indigenous fishers, commercial fishers, etc. If they don't all agree to a recommendation, the minister gets to make the call. So as you can imagine, Indigenous groups and the stakeholders that sit on these tables really consider what kinds of trade-offs they're willing to take, and they work together for the common good. This not only produces collegiality amongst them, but they all live together in the community as well. So it creates like a better community feel, and everyone seems to be pretty happy with it. But co-management is difficult to manifest. So why? Specifically in my region, like I said, the returns of salmon are very low. It's a contested resource. There are many groups trying to get a piece of the pie, so to speak, but the pie isn't big enough anymore to satisfy everyone. So that blends into this idea of the competing interests and values. Everyone wants to harvest for themselves, so they don't always look at the bigger picture. And this is, of course, a value-laden process, right? Like everyone has their own opinions about, and informed opinions, sorry, about how fisheries should be managed. So co-management on the west coast of Vancouver Island was born out of conflict. I actually had one respondent to my interviews that I conducted a couple of years ago now, who was telling me that in the 80s, they would get so angry that they were like throwing cats at fisheries managers, and it got pretty aggressive. There were fights, there were table flipping, antagonizing other stakeholders, you name it really. So this is a way to keep everything under wraps so that they can hear out everyone's concerns. And what they found is back in the day, the department was making all of these decisions for the West Coast fisheries in Ottawa. Local voices weren't being heard, right? Ottawa's governing from really, really far away. So they didn't understand how to, they didn't really understand the actual concerns on the ground, or in the ocean, I should say. You can understand how this mismatch would have occurred, and that's assuming that the information they sent over was correct. So we know how the federal government kind of works, right? Like they have their reps out in Vancouver, they go into the different streams, they check on them when they have the mandate to do so. That part's important because timing is of the essence when we're talking about marine ecosystems. But the ocean's always changing, and their science protocol is not always right. So how long does it take to even get those reports to Ottawa once they're finished, right? Like it's like publishing a research paper. By the time you finish you collect your data, like I said, I did my interviews about 2 years ago. I just finished transcribing them this year. So now that by the time I finish my data analysis, I find the framing that I want to put it in. I send it over to the journal that I've selected. It gets peer reviewed, and then it finally gets published. Well, that's a lot of steps from start to finish. But when you're dealing, I mean, in academia, we deal with that. But when we're looking at the marine ecosystem, it's not going to wait for us to publish that paper, right? So it really requires this local management. So how does co-management materialize on the west coast of Vancouver Island? So like I mentioned, West Coast Aquatic, who is my community partner on the west coast of Vancouver Island. They're an ENGO. They're a group of consultants. There are 2 of them right now, Mark and Tawny, who are in that picture, who facilitate and arrange meetings that are based in specific areas of interest, specific like geographic areas of interest. They're also responsible of collecting user groups, Indigenous communities, and DFO representatives who are stakeholders of salmon in that region, who are invited to attend these meetings. If you want to engage in the meetings, to actually be able to speak at the meetings, you have to be invited, you have to be a stakeholder, but people in the community can come in and just listen if they wanted to. There are 2 main areas for their tables are harvest and stewardship, but they deal with how to manage fisheries in general, enhancement efforts, openings and closures of fisheries, and of course, harvesting. why does stress occur in co-management meetings? So we used the framework of a workplace because in the co-management meetings, in the harvest co-management meetings or roundtables, I'll call them now that I've explained that. In the harvest roundtables, it's very much for the resource, and these people are coming in as representatives of the people that they work for. So it's kind of like a work thing that they do. So a lot of these user groups in Indigenous communities not only rely on salmon economically to feed their families, but they also grew up on the coast where fishing is a recreational and community building activity. So there's like an emotional connection to the resource as well. Indigenous groups specifically have a special spiritual connection with salmon. So the loss of this species would very much impact and disrupt their worldview. Other user groups as well have built a relationship with the land, and it's not uncommon for them to have been fishing there for generations. Not as long as Indigenous groups, of course, but there's definitely some legacy there. Our framing of the paper was housed, So instances of personal stress within co-management. We found that these were the main themes through the interviews: costs of participation, frustration with the process, coping with conflict, burden of representation, and social ecological uncertainty and consequences. So costs of participation. We found that participants said that they had time that was lost, economic costs, strains on their career and family life, and a loss of other opportunities. So one of the biggest ones that stood out for me when I was going through the interviews was this one guy who he was a sport fisher. He owned a fishing lodge in Vancouver Island, in Tofino specifically. And the rest of the year, so the 6 months he spent working there, but then the rest of the year, he actually lived in Banff with his family. So when they had off-season meetings, he actually had to fly from Banff to Vancouver, take the ferry over to Vancouver Island, rent a car in Nanaimo, and drive down to Tofino. And maybe he took the other ferry, Alert Bay, but anyway, it's a lot, is my point. So it was like, you go into these meetings and you really invest yourself in the process. So people also alluded to frustration with the process. They felt feelings of disillusionment, disappointment, a lack of recognition, and a lack of result. So if you see this, for example, lack of results, and you tie it in with the guy from Banff I was just talking about, well, that's going to produce significant sources of stress. But when it comes to Indigenous peoples, the stress is compounded because the relationship with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and Indigenous peoples appears to be mending, but they're still losing salmon and marine habitat in the process. And then the other thing that I wanted to note on is Canada actually works in a trilateral governance system. So the roundtable boards the roundtables that we're talking about today are actually advisory boards. They're volunteer-based. The department doesn't have to use the information from the meetings if they don't want to. It's not written into policy or law. But then there's another wedge, and that's where the treaties come in. So the department does sign into very specific rules with Indigenous groups, and it's laid out, like, trust me, there are hundreds and hundreds of pages, these things. And so there's this wedge where Indigenous groups have like a stronger voice than the other ones, and rightfully so. And then the top tier is the minister, and the minister just always gets the final say if it can be argued in the guise of conservation. So when we talk about the people who are at the bottom tier, you can understand these like feelings of disillusionment, these feelings of disappointment, because what's almost like hidden in plain sight is that middle wedge and that top tier. So coping with conflict. Allocation rights, emotional strain, competing views, lack of knowledge, translation, and transfer. Those are the biggest ones that we saw as conflictual. So allocation rights is the biggest one, right? Like if Fred gets, I don't know, 100 salmon, I'm using silly numbers here, but if Fred gets 100 salmon and then Bob in the sports fishery only gets 50, then they're going to feel like, oh, why did Fred get more than me, blah blah blah. So the allocation rights are a big deal in Vancouver, on the west coast of Vancouver Island when it comes to salmon, and that causes like emotional strain. The competing views also tie in with the allocation rights. And then the biggest one that we found here though was the lack of knowledge, translation, and transfer. So what's happening in these groups is, I found in my interviews, and this this is kind of just like an idea at the moment. I haven't actually clarified it yet. But what I found was that the conflict actually is within groups. So like biologists will fight with other biologists. You know, sports fishers will fight with other sports fishers, things like that. And the reason why is because there's a lack of knowledge translation between the two groups. So they're actually just speaking different languages. They're speaking, but they're not understanding, right? So that's a big source of conflict. Then we have the burden of representation. So the biggest one in here was the responsibility to relay information. Basically, what will happen is they will have to, some people are just like, so all of these user groups, they're figureheads, right? They're representatives of the jobs that they work in. So responsibility to relay information, so you go into the table, you collect this information, but now how do I go and bring that back to the people that I'm working with? How do I tell my family that I'm not going to be able to feed them this summer or whatever it is? So that one was a really big deal and a really big cause of stress. Participants as intermediaries, that was just basically like participants getting along with one another or not, right? I mean, if you break bread over lunch and you have like a casual relationship, I always like to say in these co-management arrangements, people are causally brought on. They're brought on for a purpose, but they make these casual relationships, and that forms the trust that is so important and inherent to this process and to the process working. So if participants have the opposite of that, if they don't like each other, then that trust breaks, and that can be a burden as well. Then we have job satisfaction. You know, if you're a biologist and you kind of just like sitting behind the desk of the fish farm that you work at, and all of a sudden you're presenting your data to these groups who are ready to, you know, not be quite so friendly with you, that can impact your job satisfaction. And then that kind of ties into being voluntold to go. So I heard that a million times in my interviews. It's like, oh, why were you sent? Why was someone else not sent? It's like, it's voluntold. So here I am. Social ecological uncertainty and consequences was the other one. So like I said, these communities have like a connection with the environment. They have a care for the environment. So when they see the roundtables that what they think is the best way of managing the resource for the betterment of the environment, when they feel like that's not happening, there's a significant source of stress that's caused there. And it's the same thing with caring for community. Like if that person, that Fred who got the 50 and that Bob, they got the 100 or whatever their names were, I can't remember now. But if, you know, maybe the guy with 100 feels really bad for the guy with 50 because he knows that he won't be able to feed his family that summer. So, I mean, those trade-offs kind of play out at the table as well. And people do share when the trust is proper and friendships are made. The burden of responsibility was the biggest one here. So basically at the table, like I said, they create like local management decisions that are enacted by the government, like pretty much immediately. So if the scientists get it wrong, if the community members get it wrong, and they overfish the wrong area that's already decimated, and they thought it was area A that was decimated, but it's actually area B. So they close area A and they fish out area B. Well, now we've decimated that population of salmon, and we're actually contributing to the loss of salmon returns rather than what the purpose of the meetings are, which is the opposite. So in all, participation in co-management can evoke substantial personal stress among the people it intends to empower. But the flip side of this is that everyone's still coming, right? Like we haven't seen a dip in participation or anything like that. Well, COVID is a different story, but in the regular meetings. So they do appreciate the process. They feel like it's important, and they want to be a part of the changes and the decisions that are impacted through these meetings. But now that we see that personal stress can be a big problem, we can impact that problem. So we have recommendations to policymakers and researchers in the paper that you all have read, so I won't go through that. But because today's class is on bridging knowledges, we'll get into that. So how do you bridge knowledge systems? So to successfully bridge knowledge systems, you have to have trust, learning by doing, working together, and reciprocity. But what do you do when the systems look like that? So traditional native knowledge, they're holistic. It includes physical and metaphysical world linked to a moral code. They have emphasis on practical application of skills and knowledge. There's a trust for the inherited wisdom. They have a respect for all things, including, they don't even disassociate with animals. They don't see them like, if I said, oh, this here is a salmon, it's a fish. In indigenous worldviews, or some indigenous worldviews, they see that salmon not just as a fish, you know what I mean? Like it has a different embodiment to them. So they also have a local verification. They have qualitative oral records, so storytelling, a lot of passing down of information through generations. Communications, yeah, so storytelling connected to life values and proper behavior, and then integrated and applied daily living and traditional subsistence practices. Western science is very different. So they have part whole, limited to evidence with explanation within the physical world. So they very much rely on science. They have emphasis on understanding mechanisms. So they do more like quantitative stuff. They use they use mathematics or physics or whatever the case may be, depending on what they're trying to impact to understand that, rather than just going on the land and exploring it themselves. There's communication of procedures, evidence, it's discipline based. So you kind of get the gist of it. We're all in academia here. It's kind of wise. But then there's also common ground, right? Like that's the good part. That's the part that makes us say like, oh, maybe there are ways to bridge these knowledges. So we all agree that the universe is unified. We agree that there's we have bodies of knowledge that are stable, but we can always modify them. Like knowledge it doesn't need to be only one thing. Like what we can prove ourselves wrong. Habits of mind, so honesty, inquisitiveness, having perseverance to find the right answer, being open-minded, so that we could kind of try to understand different ways of knowing. And then pattern recognition, knowledge of plants and animals and ecosystems, et cetera, et cetera. So in bridging Western and Indigenous systems of knowledge, we have some significant barriers, and they're on both sides. So systemic barriers, a lack of trust, and colonialism and language barriers are three of the big ones. Systemic barriers, so we have opposing worldviews. This picture, I thought it was kind of neat. It shows that Western science goes from A to B, but Indigenous knowledge kind of like uses other resources to inspire their way of knowing. So these different kinds of worldviews can be really difficult to bridge together. And then Canadian law, like some of the stuff that's written in Canadian law, because it's the word of law, we have to abide by it until we change it. So it's more bureaucratic, and it poses these different barriers when it comes to management strategies. And then the biggest one, in my opinion, is actually just closed-mindedness and unwillingness. So at the table, sometimes you'll see, or you'll hear from other participants that, the DFO chair on that table just doesn't care. They're older, they're burnt out, they whatever the table wants, like they'll pass it. Or you'll have the other side, which is just, they have a very specific way of understanding the world. And when it comes to incorporating different knowledges and different ideas, and that's not even just specific to Indigenous knowledges, just knowledges in general, but it's more difficult with the Indigenous knowledges because, like you can see, they're harder to bridge. They just won't do it. So that poses a big problem. And then we have the lack of trust and colonialism. So as we all know here, we have a history of colonialism in Canada, and it's still ongoing. That's causing a massive lack of trust in Indigenous communities, for Indigenous peoples. So I just took this out of the Fisheries Act, and it states very clearly, like 6.11, in the management of fisheries, the minister shall implement measures to maintain major fish stocks at or above the level necessary to promote the sustainability, there's our conservation there, of the stock, taking into account the biology, there's Western science, of the fish and the environmental conditions affecting the stock. So, I mean, you can see how that's super pointed towards the Department of Fisheries and Oceans managing, and it doesn't really enable other voices into being mobilized. I mean, of course, through treaties, we see that there are these processes of reconciliation that complement acts such as these. But if we're talking about the Fisheries Act specifically, this is kind of the way that it's laid out. Then we have the language barriers. So for me, there are two different kinds of things when it comes to language barriers. There are literal language barriers, like we're speaking completely different languages. But then there are opposing worldviews and not understanding what they're saying. So let me be like very clear here. Speaking and understanding are or listening and understanding are completely different things, right? So if you don't open your mind to understand what someone else is saying, do the work to tease out exactly what their meaning is when they say important things that you want to know about, then you're not understanding, you're just listening. And that can be seen in this picture here that I pulled out of Sparks' book. If anyone wants the references, by the way, I have them, I can send them out to you. So in the book, we see that when they're in the Law versus Ayuk case, the indigenous groups already have a diminished position of power. They're not sitting in the big chair with the robe on, right? Like they're sitting at the side. And when they're talking about cartography, they see it as trees and symbols, and it's fluid. Whereas when you look at the judge, it's cartography, right? Like they have all of these books that are inspiring these maps, and everything's laid out and it's very specific lines and stuff. So how do we kind of complement those two ideas? And then that's kind of where we can see these opposing worldviews. But there's good news. We have some work that tells us that we have ways to bridge these knowledge systems. One of the big ones is adaptive co-management. Sorry, I need to, okay. So the first one's adaptive co-management. So it's a learning by doing, deals with uncertainty and complexity in a place of set management prescriptions. It has become collaborative in practice, and time-tested co-management increasingly relies on learning by doing. What's really important through this quote is it's time-tested co-management. The roundtables that I work with, they've been going on for about a decade now. So we can see adaptive co-management actually happening, which is pretty cool in those tables. And what it is it's taking the ideas of co-management, but actually adapting it to the ground. So working on the ground with other people around us, which leads us into Cook's article that just came out last year. And he says that research is conducted collaboratively. So Cook is a biologist that works at Carleton University. So the et al, it was him and his research team. And a little bit of background here is that the local Hunters and Trappers Association in the region he worked in, which was in Nunavut, they reached out to his research group to initiate a collaboration for the Genome Canada large-scale applied research project for sustainable fisheries. So that's kind of the context within which this paper was written. They used a knowledge co-production framework to involve the Indigenous communities and they said that it should be centered on defining the objectives of enhancing local capacity for self-determination and resource management. So they very much wanted to like validate what they were doing by working hand in hand with Indigenous communities and other user groups in that area so that they could explain like I said, I'm not a natural scientist. So if someone throws up a Genome Canada graph, I'm not going to be able to understand that. But if I go on the ground with people who are working in genetics and they're like, hey, look, like this is what it looks like. This is a tangible thing that you can see, feel, understand. Then you get to interrogate the process. You can ask questions, and that's kind of this co-production of knowledge. So in the definition, he says, or they say, that research is conducted collaboratively, inclusively, and in a respectful and engaged manner, from the identification of the actual research need to the study design, data collection, interpretation, application, the ideas of creating actionable science and benefits to the partners involved. If we're not benefiting our partners involved, like what are we doing there, right? Even when we're writing in social sciences or in architecture or in climate change adaptation, we're looking to impact some sort of real life change. Even if we're writing theoretically or whatever the case may be, the idea is to better the groups or the thing that we're working with. So he goes on to say, we define knowledge co-production as the contribution of multiple knowledge sources, ways of knowing, and perspectives from different user groups with the goal of co-creating knowledge and information to inform fisheries management and conservation. So what was really interesting about this project is that this group, one of them being Chapman, which I'll get into, and I'll get into their stuff in a second, but their group, they actually realized that in working together, it became clear that knowledge co-production was not sufficient for meaningfully connecting and strengthening distinct knowledge systems. The community partners were purposely involved in the stages relevant for fisheries monitoring and research. But the team that was facilitating these tests of new fisheries, they realized that their process, their guide to getting to that end, that goal, the co-management didn't the co-production of knowledge structure, they had to actually change it a little bit because they realized that they were producing knowledge in parallels rather than like an integrated knowledge that could be applied to the ground. So then we have the work of Chapman and Scott. And like I said, Chapman was one of the authors in the previous paper who say, okay, well, how do we fix this? What are the things that we changed in the co-production of knowledge to engage everyone's knowledges in a more integrated way? And so they came up with a coevolution of knowledge. So they say, most importantly, knowledge coevolution should work to strengthen traditional knowledge and not focus on changing or merging traditional knowledge with Western scientific methods. Knowledge coevolution allows both knowledge systems to advance and evolve on their own, while also generating new knowledge for the benefit of Indigenous stakeholders by generating data that's meaningful for decision-making and participation of Indigenous people in the governance of their lives and the ecosystems that they rely on. So they said that, we have these Indigenous ways of knowing, we have these Western scientific ways of knowing, where can we match them? Which aspects of each of them can we put together for the better management of this resource? So again, going back to the master of none stuff, right? Like you have these people, you have these groups that are fantastic at what they do, but we can't just have masters of one. We have to have this integrated model. We have to have these masters working together for the betterment of the whole. So what now? We're in COVID-19. Most of my arguments during this presentation have been that co-management is focused on trust and breaking bread together and going into the streams and really looking at the tangible, like the tangible eggs or the runs or whatever it may be, and using those experiences together to not only form trust and collegiality and community building and friendships, but also in understanding and translating these knowledges from different groups. So in COVID-19, how do you do that? So West Coast Aquatic did something pretty awesome that I'm going to share with you guys. They rerouted their funding strategies that were used for luncheons and renting out spaces and things like that. And they actually built infrastructure in coastal communities that didn't have access to Skype or landlines even, because we're talking about the west coast of Vancouver Island. Like some of it is pretty untouched out there. So they used their funding in these ways so that they could still involve those voices that would have otherwise not been heard during this time, which has been, pretty lengthy time now. So all of this is to say that adaptive co-management, these coevolutions of knowledge, working together to build trust so that over time we can create better people management for the actual co-management and proper management of fisheries and salmon. And we have these different ideas, and we put them all together, we have something really beautiful. So in order to keep co-management strong, we just have to keep working together. We have to keep building those relationships, putting the right people in the right roles, and engaging stakeholders and Indigenous groups for the betterment of salmon and the betterment for us. So that's the end of my presentation. If anyone has any questions, I guess we'll have a little question period now, but there's my email for anyone who wants it. I can throw it up in the chat while I stop, if you don't catch it while I stop my screen. And if you wanted to read any of those articles, I'm more than happy to send them